Hello, welcome to another edition of The Debate. I'm Kabatapwe. The situation in Syria is getting complicated by the day. There are possibilities that Turkey and Saudi Arabia could launch a ground operation. This is while Russia's prime minister has said that Washington's statements on possible ground operations in negotiations is a wrong turn, that this may turn into a world war. In this edition of The Debate, we'll discuss how strong a possibility a world war is, while the Syrian army, backed by Russian airstrikes, is making huge advances on the ground. Now, one of the venues of which security has been laid out, and top of the agenda of this venue has been the situation in Syria. Our correspondent Homa Lesky has been at the venue in Munich, the name being the Munich Security Conference, and she now joins us to tell us more about that venue. Okay, Homa, so here we have a security conference in Munich, and it seems like the world is not safe, and that goes against what the security conference should have. So therefore, now, tell us what has been the highlights from this conference.
You know, I think I can start, Kava, by saying that the fact that the International Syria Support Group was held just a day before the security conference in Munich officially began shows how important the Syria situation and the war in Syria has become now. It was, as you said, the focus of the security conference, which is still ongoing. Yesterday, of course, we had comments by the Saudi foreign minister, also by the Iranian foreign minister. And as Saudi Arabia was continuing its rhetoric of continuing its fights in Yemen and continuing the same policies in Syria, the Iranian foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, said that unless all parties, including Iran and Saudi Arabia, don't make that effort to work together, then the Syria crisis is going to continue. Today we had more comments from the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, and also from the US Secretary of State, John Kerry. Now, the US position was very similar to the Saudi one, as you, I think, know already, with John Kerry again reiterating that he believes as long as there is support for President Bashar al-Assad, then this will encourage more, in his words, jihadists or terrorist fighters to join the battle against Assad. This is what Saudi Arabia has also said. On the other hand, Russia said the reason why the fight against terrorists is not being successful is because there are certain advantages being considered by players like Saudi Arabia and the US for regime change in Syria because of their own geopolitical concerns. So another issue that I just mentioned quickly, Kaveh, if I have time, is that Russia made it clear it is ready to cooperate with Washington militarily in the military sphere, and it even called on Washington to get engaged with Russia in that sphere if it really has the intention to defeat terrorists. That was what Mr. Lavrov said today at the security conference, which I thought was a very important comment.
Okay, I'm going to ask you this because this has been very perplexing, and that is the fact that Russia has said and requested from the U.S. to give and provide a list of these so-called rebels or so-called opposition groups. The U.S. has refused to do so, and yet the U.S. and the regional allies are accusing Russia of bombarding these groups. So, you know, it goes against the Russian request, which, in the spirit of cooperation, the U.S. did not reciprocate.
That's the thing that we heard from Mr. Lavrov today. Again, as you mentioned there, again, he said that although Russia has been insisting on this, not just about the list of terrorist groups that you mentioned there, but also to get involved militarily in the military plans that are being pursued against various groups. Although these requests have been made in the past, the US has always rejected them, has not been cooperating with Russia, and that's where the differences are. You know, when I was asking the Iranian foreign minister yesterday, although there is some agreement, for instance, on humanitarian assistance, although not a sustained humanitarian assistance, what are the differences? He was again pointing to the fact that we still need that agreement on who the terrorists are, who are the known terrorists. At the moment, Daesh or ISIL, as well as al-Nusra, has been recognized by everyone, including the United Nations, as the terrorist group. What about others? What about Ahrar al-Sham, Jaish al-Islam, groups that are being supported by Saudi Arabia? It seems that there is an unwillingness, at least from the sides, as you mentioned there in that question, to come to an agreement on these terrorist groups, on these groups that are known as terrorists by some, are known as legitimate opposition by others. So, as you say, that is an important factor that unfortunately has still not been resolved.
Thank you for that. We appreciate it. That's Homa Lesky at the side of what's called the Munich Security Conference. We appreciate that. Let us get some analysis on this. We have our guest joining us for this edition of the debate, journalist and political commentator Hafsa Kara Mustafa, who joins us from London. We have President of the Middle East Research Center, Richard Hellman, who joins us from Washington. I'd like to welcome both of our guests. Richard Hellman, we were just talking to our correspondents there, and the big question here is, does the U.S. Really understand who it's supporting when it comes to these groups on the ground, of which they call the opposition, and yet they're associated of being either terrorists or guilty of conspiring with terrorists, and the consequences that this has entailed?
Well, I think there is a lack of understanding as to who is who and who is on which side. But the basic bottom line, I just returned from the Middle East from a mission to Israel, and we saw Free Syria forces, Free Syria soldiers, 3 of them with their legs shot away in a hospital room being repaired and healed and given support by the Israel medical doctors. But and last June I was on the Golan Heights watching al-Nusra and Assad's forces from Damascus fighting for Quneitra. So this has gone on way too long, 5 years. We need a serious UN Security Council decision, Article 7 decision ordering a ceasefire, and the U.S. had called on all nations to have a peacekeeping force, an international peacekeeping force to be put in there to separate the forces, have a no-fire zone and a place of refuge for the many refugees who are fleeing. 300,000 Syrians have been killed mostly by Assad's forces with the help of Hezbollah and the Russians and more, and Iran. So this has gone way too far, and I don't believe that America, sadly, has a serious or credible Middle East or a Syrian policy. We must develop one, and if the administration doesn't develop one, we're urging the Congress to lay one out in law to indicate what the U.S. interests are and what the humanitarian interests are so that the killing stops.
Okay. Well, I was taken aback there, Hafsakar Mustafa, by Richard Hellman talking about how members of the Free Syrian Army are being treated at an Israeli makeshift hospital. So let's start with that comment from Richard Hellman and your reaction.
Well, I think if there was ever a reason explaining why Assad is actually on the right side of this issue, is to actually show that the Free Syrian Army is actually in cahoots with Israel. I think that really indicates that they clearly don't have Syria's best interest at heart. Excuse me, I didn't interrupt. Do not interrupt me. And you speak for a very long time, so please do not interrupt.
They're not.
I think it obviously indicates the role Israel's been playing in both propping up the FSA and both terrorist organizations. We know that they've been actually helping and treating ISIS members and other various terrorist organizations that have actually contributed to destroying Syria and slaughtering the vast majority of Syrian civilians. I think it's fair to say that today, when you ask the majority of Syrians in Syria, they will all, most of them obviously will tell you that they support that Assad remains in power because he has been instrumental in fighting the terrorists that are funded and supported by Israel and also by Saudi Arabia, by Qatar and also by Turkey. So it is clear who has Syria's best interest at heart and who is actually working tirelessly to destroy it. And I think at this moment in time, anything that comes from the US has to be rejected. I would obviously have appreciated a more concerted effort from the region, from regional powers who are working with the official Syrian government to actually pursue this fight against terrorism. I think the idea that Saudi Arabia could contribute to anything further in Syria is farcical and actually borderline criminal, given its history of funding and supporting terrorist organizations. But it has to be said, it's not just the US or Saudi Arabia. Countries like France, for instance, Laurent Fabius famously said last year at a conference that Jabhat al-Nusra was doing a great job, and I quote, a great job in Syria, when we know today that Jabhat al-Nusra is fighting, both the international coalition supposedly fighting ISIS is also fighting Jabhat al-Nusra. So it is very clear at this point who wants to see Syria destroyed and who wants to save it. And obviously anyone working with Israel, with Saudi Arabia or with the US clearly does not want to see Syria saved.
Richard Hellman, why is it that when Russia has requested from the U.S. to provide a list of these groups on the ground, that the U.S. has refused to do so? and at the same time U.S. requesting Russia to stop its airstrikes. Does that make sense?
No, these are straw men, red herrings, and Israel is not supporting any side in the war. Israel's heart goes out to whomever is wounded in Syria and who is dumped on the Israel border with Syria in hopes that they can restore these poor souls. There also was a
like
small
the 5,000 Palestinians, they had a humanitarian issue with them, did they?
Please stop.
It cuts both ways.
It cuts both ways. Please stop. Listen, that's enough. So I saw this young boy with no arms, no legs, and no eyes lying on his stomach, and the Israelis are trying to maintain his life and restore him. But 300,000 and more have been killed by Assad's forces with the help of the Russian airstrikes, with the help of Iran-sponsored Hezbollah. But the point is, the killing has to stop. The UN has to get serious. There has to be a cessation of Russian airstrikes and Syrian airstrikes. There has to be a no-fly zone. There has to be a place of refuge. And I'm not sure who, if anyone, are, quote, the good guys in Syria today. It's not a point of picking sides, but the UN must intervene with a strong UN peacekeeping force and a peacemaking and peacekeeping force, and sort it out so that there can be elections, so that the unelected president of Syria, like his unelected father, can either be elected properly or replaced, and restore some sanity to Syria after 5 years. But Israel is not involved, nor is America trying to pick sides. But America should, with Russia and the other members of the Security Council, say enough is enough. Stop the killing.
I think I got a reaction from you when Richard Hellman said America has not picked sides. Hafsakar Mustafa.
I think it's so utterly ridiculous what I'm actually hearing that it's difficult to comment on this. First of all, to hear that Israel acts with in a bid to save on humanitarian grounds. Where was its humanity when it was pounding Gaza, killing and slaughtering over 5,000 Palestinians? So the idea that somehow Israel acts for humanity is ridiculous. Israel has actually collaborated with the terrorist organizations, and do not interrupt. Do not interrupt. It cuts both ways, or I won't stop, and we'll behave in the same way that you do. So either you stop, or I will not stop. I will not stop. And don't play as if you're defending Israel. Israel is a terrorist state, and it's at war with Syria, and it occupies Syrian land. It still occupies the Syrian Golan Heights. So everything that is said, the idea that America is not picking sides when it is blatantly criticizing Russia for pounding terrorists in collaboration with the official Syrian government, again, is farcical. And we know that the American government has been funding, like the British government and like the French, have been funding the opposition, the Syrian opposition. So they've clearly taken sides. Whether that opposition has been acting politically in the comfort of Parisian and Swiss hotels, or whether that opposition has actually taken up arms and slaughtered and beheaded civilians, the bottom line is that the US, like most Western capitals, has actually taken sides and continues to take sides and opposes the legitimacy of the Syrian president, who today enjoys the overwhelming support of the Syrian population, a population which, let's remind viewers, is 70%, over 80% actually Sunni Muslim. Therefore, the idea that this has taken a sectarian element and everything is also part of the propaganda, because the majority of the population still supports an Alawite president, regardless of the sectarian divide. So again, we've been fed a lot of propaganda over the past 5 years by people such as Mr. Hellman and obviously other pundits who appear on TV in a bid to sell and perpetrate constant war in the Middle East, because obviously the bombs are not flying above their heads. The people slaughtered are not their fellow citizens. Therefore, when it is Arabs, when it is Iranians, when it is Iraqis, when it is Afghans, when it is Yemenis, they don't mind that there's continuous and ongoing war. But the bottom line is that there is a conflict today involving terrorist organizations and countries that sponsor terrorism, such as Israel, such as Saudi Arabia, such as the US, and the only countries that are fighting these terrorists, the Syrians, the Russians, and obviously with the help of Iran and Hezbollah.
Okay, I know you have a reaction, but hold on to your thoughts. Let's take a quick listen to some of the viewer comments as posted on our Facebook page, and we'll get back to the topic of this debate.
It's laughable for Saudi Arabia to create so many fronts which at the end will not be able to sustain. If they have failed to control Yemen, how can they withstand Russian, Iranian, Syrian and Hezbollah fire? As usual, Turkey and the Salafi regime in Riyadh are trying to help their terrorists kill the forces that resist their Western-backed agenda to divide and rule Syria. It's a brilliant action by Saudi Arabia and Turkey to just make Assad and its allied forces stop massacring Syria. Bashar al-Assad is waiting to send back their troops in wooden coffins. If Saudi Arabia and Turkey move ahead with a ground invasion, Syria would be their graveyard.
Just some of the viewer comments there. Richard Hellman, is really perplexing, and maybe you could explain it, when you have two regions in Aleppo that were under siege by these terrorists for 4 years, and then with the help of Russian airstrikes and the Syrian army on the ground, Iran in the advisory role, they were liberated. And that's when Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the U.S. come out and say Russia is doing the wrong thing. They're targeting they shouldn't be targeting the so-called rebels on the ground. They should commend Russia for that, for liberating these two towns. Why is it the opposite?
Well, in short, this is just a continuation of the butchery that Bashar al-Assad's forces and his air force with barrel bombs have been killing untold numbers of civilians, as well as indiscriminately killing the forces opposing the Assad regime. But this begs the question: the international community must intervene if they ever were called upon to intervene to stop the killing. There was supposed to be a ceasefire, and the Russians said, well, we'll stop bombing in about a week. And there is no indication that the Syrian Air Force will stop its bombing, and the assault continues. The point is that these assaults, yes, from the Assad regime, but also from a number of the rebel regimes, are killing indiscriminately men, women, and children, as I've seen with my own eyes. And this must stop. It's not a point of picking sides. I wish that America had a more clearly articulated policy, and I wish that America was making this priority number one in the Security Council of the United Nations to call upon Russia and China and France and Britain and say that we need a robust Security Council resolution compelling the end of that internal conflict and the genocide that has been ongoing for 5 years, as Bashar al-Assad has killed more than 250,000 of his own people and displaced millions of refugees in the country, outside the country, and to the four corners of the earth, on something like 1/3 of the entire population of Syria. So Iran, Russia, the Syrian regime in Damascus, Hezbollah, and the others cannot call themselves blameless. There's obviously those who are opposing them also have been accused and proved. Some of them have been proved to be butchering people indiscriminately, but the UN Security Council is remiss in not taking the most robust action under Article 7 to compel the end to this killing and to send in a sufficient force, international force, to stop the killing and set up a process for real democratic elections in which all the people of Syria can choose a government and stop the killing and stop the destruction and stop the emigration and restore poor bleeding Syria, which is an international crime. It's on the conscience of all of the powers of the world right now.
Okay, let me bring in our guest Hafsa Kar Mustafa. Well, Richard Hellman, our guest there in Washington, is talking about the UN. We're having these peace talks, and yet the so-called Syrian opposition walked out because Saudi Arabia, Qatar instructed the Syrian opposition to walk out because of the advances that were being made on the ground. It went at the same time when the walkout occurred, of which Staffan de Mistura came out and said, okay, time for a pause, of which is supposed to resume in a week. Do you think that these talks even have a chance? The Russian foreign minister saying 49% chance of them even happening in a matter of a week.
Well, this is the problem. I think all the people who are involved... can I speak? Can I speak? This is not the Richard Hellman show. Thank you very much. I think the problem when you look at the rhetoric coming from the Syrian opposition and all those who've sided with the Syrian opposition is there is a very clear lack of will to see peace. Because let's put it this way, if it was your country and if you did have its best interest at heart, if you disheartened by the scale of human suffering, by the destruction, you would negotiate. You would accept to speak with even your worst enemy as long as you're bringing this bloodshed and chaos to an end. And when you're hearing that these people don't even want to envisage any negotiation, don't want to be in any way compromising because they have issued ultimatums and have not engaged in actual negotiations, you can actually see that the fate of Syria is the last thing on their mind. Because let's be honest, this is a human instinct. When the bombs are falling on your head, you want them to stop. But these people in the opposition, in the political opposition, they are residing comfortably in Western capitals, being funded at great cost by Western capitals, and therefore they're not bearing the brunt of the suffering. Sorry, those who are suffering, on the other hand, are the Syrian people. And the majority of the Syrian people in Syria have repeated and have expressed, and there are opinion polls time and time and again saying that they want an end to this war and they want to still be led by Bashar al-Assad. Now, whether the US or whether Saudi Arabia doesn't want Bashar al-Assad to remain, that is fine. But it is not for the US or Saudi Arabia or any other foreign entity to decide who should lead Syria. It is for the Syrian people. And after 5 years of war and after a coalition of several countries actually meddling into their affairs, coming in, sending their mercenaries, sending their terrorists, Syrians have had enough. They want to be led by their own president. They want to see an end of this conflict, and they have actually fully acknowledged that anyone who has collaborated with the enemies of Syria does not deserve to be involved in any future, on any political future of the country, because these are the traitors, the sellouts and the criminals who have actually led Syria down this path. Anyone who defends the territorial integrity of their country deserves a future in Syria, but all those who have collaborated with its worst enemies have clearly had Syria's best interests certainly not at heart.
Thank you for that. We're going to have to end it there. Journalist and political commentator Hafsakar Mustafa from London and president of the Middle East Research Center, Richard Hellman from Washington. Earlier we had our correspondent Homa Leski talking to us from Munich. Thank you so much for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. From me, Kaveh Takwai, and the entire team in the capital, Tehran, is goodbye.